Mattie's mind, as being the way which her mother had preferred. The curtain was drawn so as to exclude the dead brick wall of a neighbour's stable, and yet left so as to show every tender leaf of the poplar which was bursting into spring beauty. Martha's tone to Miss Matty was just such as that good, rough-spoken servant usually kept sacred for little children, and which I had never heard her use to any grown-up person. I had forgotten to tell Miss Matty about the pudding, and I was afraid she might not do justice to it, for she had evidently very little appetite this day, so I seized the opportunity of letting her into the secret while Martha took away the meat. Miss Matty's eyes filled with tears, and she could not speak, either to express surprise or delight, when Martha returned bearing it aloft, made in the most wonderful representation of a lion couchant that was ever moulded. Martha's face gleamed with triumph as she set it down before Miss Matty with an exultant "There!" Miss Matty wanted to speak her thanks, but could not, so she took Martha's hand and shook it warmly, which set Martha off crying, and I myself could hardly keep up the necessary composure. Martha burst out of the room, and Miss Matty had to clear her voice once or twice before she could speak. At last she said, "I should like to keep this pudding under a glass shade, my dear," and the notion of the lion couchant, with his currant eyes, being hoisted up to the place of honour on a mantelpiece, tickled my hysterical fancy, and I began to laugh, which rather surprised Miss Matty. "I am sure, dear, I have seen uglier things under a glass shade before now," said she. So had I, many a time and oft, and I accordingly composed my countenance, and now I could hardly keep from crying, and we both fell upon the pudding, which was indeed excellent, only every morsel seemed to choke us, our hearts were so full. We had too much to think about to talk much that afternoon. It passed over very tranquilly. But when the tea-urn was brought in, a new thought came into my head. Why should not Miss Matty sell tea? Be an agent to the East India Tea Company which then existed? I could see no objections to this plan, while the advantages were many, always supposing that Miss Matty could get over the degradation of condescending to anything like trade. Tea was neither greasy nor sticky, grease and stickiness being two of the qualities which Miss Matty could not endure. No shop window would be required. A small genteel notification of her being licensed to sell tea would, it is true, be necessary, but I hoped that it could be placed where no one would see it. Neither was tea a heavy article, so as to tax Miss Matty's fragile strength. The only thing against my plan was the buying and selling involved. While I was giving but absent answers to the questions Miss Matty was putting, almost as absently, we heard a clumping sound on the stairs, and a whispering outside the door, which indeed once opened and shut as if by some invisible agency. After a little while Martha came in, dragging after her a great tall young man, all crimson with shyness, and finding his only relief in perpetually sleeking down his hair. "Please, ma'am, he is only Jem Hearn," said Martha by way of an introduction; and so out of breath was she that I imagined she had had some bodily struggle before she could overcome his reluctance to be presented on the courtly scene of Miss Matilda Jenkyns's drawing-room. "And please, ma'am, he wants to marry me off-hand. And please, ma'am, he wants to take a lodger, just one quiet one, to make our two ends meet, and we'd take any house comfortable; and oh dear Miss Matty, if I may be so bold, would you have any objections to lodging with us? Jem wants it as much as I do." To Jem, "You great oaf, why can't you back me? But he does want it all the same very bad, don't you, Jem? Only, you see, he's dazed at being called on to speak before quality." "It's not that," broke in Jem. "It's that you've taken me all on a sudden, and I didn't think for to get married so soon. And such quick words does flabbergast a man. It's not that I'm against it, ma'am," addressing Miss Matty, "only Martha has such quick ways with her when she once takes a thing into her head; and marriage, ma'am, marriage nails a man, as one may say. I daresay I shan't mind it after it's once over." "Please, ma'am," said Martha, who had plucked at his sleeve, and nudged him with her elbow, and otherwise tried to interrupt him all the time he had been speaking, "don't mind him, he'll come too. 'Twas only last night he was an axing me, and all the more because I said I could not think of it for years to come; and now he's only taken aback with the suddenness of the joy. But you know, Jem, you are just as full as me about wanting a lodger." Another great nudge. "Ay, if Miss Matty would lodge with us; otherwise I've no mind to be cumbered with strange folk in the house," said Jem, with the want of tact which I could see enraged Martha, who was trying to represent a lodger as the only object they wished to obtain, and that in fact Miss Matty would be smoothing their path and conferring a favour, if she would only come and live with them. Miss Matty herself was bewildered by the pair; their, or rather Martha's, sudden resolution in favour of matrimony staggered her, and stood between her and the contemplation of the plan which Martha had at heart. Miss Matty began, "Marriage is a very solemn thing, Martha." "It is indeed, ma'am," quoth Jem. "Not that I've no objections to Martha." "You've never let me be a asking for me to fix when I would be married," said Martha, her face all afire, and ready to cry with vexation; "and now you're shaming me before my missus and all." "Nay, now, Martha, don't 'ee, only a man likes to have breathing time," said Jem, trying to possess himself of her hand, but in vain. Then, seeing she was more seriously hurt than he had imagined, he seemed to try to rally his scattered faculties, and with more straightforward dignity than, 10 minutes before, I should have thought it possible for him to assume, he turned to Miss Matty and said— "I hope, ma'am, you know that I am bound to respect every one who has been kind to Martha. I always looked on her as to be my wife, sometime, and she has often and often spoken of you as the kindest lady that ever was; and though the plain truth is, I would not like to be troubled with lodgers of the common run, yet if, ma'am, you'd honour us by living with us, I'm sure Martha would do her best to make you comfortable, and I'd keep out of your way as much as I could, which I reckon would be about the best kindness such an awkward chap as me could do." Miss Matty had been very busy with taking off her spectacles, wiping them and replacing them, but all she could say was, "Don't let any thought of me hurry you into marriage, pray don't. Marriage is such a very solemn thing." "But Miss Matilda will think of your plan, Martha," said I, struck with the advantages that it offered, and unwilling to lose the opportunity of considering about it. "And I'm sure neither she nor I can ever forget your kindness, nor yours either, Jem." "Why, yes, ma'am. I'm sure I mean kindly, though I'm a bit flustered by being pushed straight ahead into matrimony, as it were, and mayn't express myself comfortable. But I'm sure I'm willing enough, and give me time to get accustomed; so, Martha, wench, what's the use of crying so, and slapping me if I come near?" This last was sotto voce, and had the effect of making Martha bounce out of the room, to be followed and soothed by her lover. Whereupon Miss Matty sat down and cried very heartily, and accounted for it by saying that the thought of Martha being married so soon gave her quite a shock, and that she should never forgive herself if she thought she was hurrying the poor creature. I think my pity was more for Jem of the two, but both Miss Matty and I appreciated to the full the kindness of the honest couple, although we said little about this, and a good deal about the chances and dangers of matrimony. The next morning, very early, I received a note from Miss Pole, so mysteriously wrapped up, and with so many seals on it to secure secrecy, that I had to tear the paper before I could unfold it. And when I came to the writing I could hardly understand the meaning, it was so involved and oracular. I made out, however, that I was to go to Miss Pole's at 11 o'clock, the number 11 being written in full length as well as in numerals, and A.M. twice dashed under, as if I were very likely to come at 11 at night, when all Cranford was usually abed and asleep by 10. There was no signature except Miss Pole's initials reversed, P.E., but as Martha had given me the note, with Miss Pole's kind regards, it needed no wizard to find out who sent it, and if the writer's name was to be kept secret, it was very well that I was alone when Martha delivered it. I went as requested to Miss Pole's. The door was opened to me by her little maid Lizzie in Sunday trim, as if some grand event was impending over this work-day. And the drawing-room upstairs was arranged in accordance with this idea. The table was set out with the best green card-cloth, and writing materials upon it. On the little chiffonier was a tray with a newly decanted bottle of cowslip wine, and some ladies' finger biscuits. Miss Pole herself was in solemn array, as if to receive visitors, although it was only 11 o'clock. Mrs Forrester was there, crying quietly and sadly, and my arrival seemed only to call forth fresh tears. Before we had finished our greetings, performed with lugubrious mystery of demeanour, there was another rat-tat-tat, and Mrs Fitz-Adams appeared, crimson with walking and excitement. It seemed as if this was all the company expected, for now Miss Pole made several demonstrations of being about to open the business of the meeting, by stirring the fire, opening and shutting the door, and coughing and blowing her nose. Then she arranged us all round the table, taking care to place me opposite to her, and last of all, she inquired of me if the sad report was true, as she feared it was, that Miss Matty had lost all her fortune. Of course, I had but one answer to make, and I never saw more unaffected sorrow depicted on any countenances than I did there on the three before me. "I wish Mrs Jamieson was here," said Mrs Forrester at last; but to judge from Mrs Fitz-Adams's face, she could not second the wish.